So in a moment of desperation, I said I'll do something on Cambridge. So what it's going to be is a very general survey of housing in Cambridge, from the Middle Ages down to the present day, with a lot of unanswered questions, I think, particularly when we get to the 20th century. But the starting point, as Evelyn's already suggested, is this. Wherever you go in Cambridge at present, it seems there are new developments taking place. Great Knighton or Great Nathan, I'm not quite sure how it's supposed to be pronounced, and I don't even know where the name comes from, being one of the obvious one. Trumpington Meadows, not very far away. Eddington out in northwest Cambridge, so on and so forth. But the town has, of course, been changing for many centuries. Although we do think that we're living in an unprecedented era of change, I don't think that's necessarily the case, as we shall see as we go along. Now, in terms of medieval Cambridge, there is virtually no medieval domestic architecture left. There is, of course, the college architecture, and as far as I know, there are only probably 2 domestic buildings. This is the first, you all know it, the School of Pythagoras, which has never been a school, has got nothing to do with Pythagoras, but is a merchant's house of around about 1200. Very typical merchant house of the period, with warehousing, storage on the ground floor, living accommodation on the first floor. And probably quite typical of what Cambridge, the more prosperous Cambridge merchants were living in at the time. The second medieval building is, of course, in a sense, far less typical. This is Chesterton Tower, which is rather later, 14th century, I think, and evidently built for the canons of an Italian monastery who had been given the parish church of Chesterton by the English crown. And consequently, they needed somewhere to stay, and this is it. But what does the rest of Cambridge look like? We can really only guess. There are no drawings of 15th, 16th century Cambridge, but there are, of course, the 2 well-known maps. The line map of the 1570s, the Hammond map of the 1590s. And this is just a small extract from the line map. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The area around the round church and St Clement's, the round church, rather charmingly called St Pulchre's, of course it's the Holy Sepulchre. He shows houses, but I think they are effectively just a conventional representation. It's just housing. He's not in any way attempted to indicate what the housing actually looks like. Perhaps thankfully, because when you look what a mess he made of King's College Chapel on the map, you shudder to think what he would have done with some of the houses in the town. And Hammond isn't really very much better. Again, the colleges are shown in some detail, but the ordinary housing in the town is simply, once again, almost a child's representation of what houses will look like. So what did Cambridge look like in the 16th century? Well, on the street frontages, it probably looked a little bit like this. I came across this illustration quite by chance on the internet, and I thought it was rather a good one to include. I'm not quite sure of the source of it, but it's obviously it's the corner of Northampton Street, where the traffic lights are now. You turn right down into Magdalen Street. And I think in terms of the general condition of the houses, if you compare them to what it's like today, this probably does give quite a good impression of the rather run-down, rather workaday working Cambridge, as distinct from University Cambridge. And, of course, by the 1800s, by the time of this map, we've got what is recognisably the Cambridge we know today. And the important point about this map of 1800 is, of course, the immense amount of land taken over by the colleges. Something like about 50% of the land area by 1800 is occupied by colleges, who have taken over, of course, what was once the commercial heart of Cambridge. The area down here along the river, Milne Street with its merchants' houses, its warehouses, the Hythes along the river, all has been swept away by the 16th century, certainly by the 17th century. The colleges dominate, and the consequence is that the residential part of the town is becoming grossly overcrowded, certainly from about 1750 onwards as population starts to grow, and people living in what can only be described as squalor. And you can get some idea, I think, from the map of the very tight-packed nature of housing. And one of the interesting features, not just of Cambridge, but I think of any town down to 1800, is the fact that you've got rich and poor living literally next door to each other. The richer people, better off people, occupying the street frontages. Behind the street frontages, you very quickly get into a rabbit warren of alleyways, courts, etc. Very different world indeed. And this was certainly the case here in Bridge Street, where we've got, again, these rather nice survivals, which look much better now than they did perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. A 16th century, I think, almost certainly, the house there. That one's, I guess, about the same age, but refronted, and rather nice windows put in. And of course, this one, the one with the overhanging jetties. All again, round about 1600, then moving on to Victorian housing behind. And if you look at maps down to the early 20th century, you can get some indication, I think, of just how overcrowded this area was. The photograph I took, standing just on the corner there, these are the big houses that we saw, the public houses, Baron of Beef, etc. And you can see immediately behind, you get into these yards, one there, St Clement's Passage up here, which is rather more upmarket, but this is very, very badly overcrowded. The same applies to the housing on the other side of Bridge Street, and also up here opposite Magdalen College. And the town is bursting at the seams. Nonetheless, there are one or two prestige buildings put up in the 18th century. Not many of them. Cambridge is not a repository of Georgian architecture, or not, at least not Georgian domestic architecture. The two best known are these, I think. The first of them is the Master's Lodge at Peterhouse, which dates from 1702. Architect unknown, but obviously somebody who was quite skilled. It could even just have been a very good builder, working from the pattern books that were becoming available at the time, which builders could buy and they could use to come up with a state-of-the-art building. And the other one, perhaps even better, is Little Trinity, which is slightly later, or so it seems, probably around about 1710 and 1712, and again a very nice piece of beautifully proportioned, beautifully symmetrical early Georgian architecture. Well, I mentioned earlier population increase. Cambridge shares in the general increase in population, the so-called demographic revolution, that starts around about 1750, 1760, for reasons which are still not wholly clear to historians, and far too complicated to go in at this moment. But in 1801, the population is at a level, as you can see, of about 10,000, having grown from probably something like about 6,000 in 1700. And it's increasing not particularly quickly over the next 20 years to 1821. There's a spurt between 21 and 31, levels off a little bit between 31 and 51, but still an upwards trend. The reason that there is a gap in the graph between 1851 and 1861 represents the fact that the census from 1861 onwards was taken out of term. So down to 1851, you're actually including undergraduates, and there are increasing numbers of undergraduates in the early 19th century. From 1861 onwards, it is what you might call the native population of the town. And again, although the growth is uneven, there's a steady upwards trend to 1901, 1911, and again a break in series in 1911, reflecting the extension of the borough boundaries to include particularly Chesterton, and then again in 1921, Trumpington and other outlying settlements are included. So you've got then a growing population that has got to be housed somewhere and somehow. And in particular, you've got a growing population in East Cambridge, the parish of St Andrew the Less. Barnwell, as it was often known, the whole area to the east of the historic town centre, which had been open fields until the early 19th century, is enclosed from 1809 onwards. And the consequence is that the town can, at long last, start to grow outward, and that the population pressure can be relieved somewhat. If you want an example of what would have happened if that hadn't been the case, look at Nottingham. Nottingham, a very interesting town, there was no enclosure until 1840. And consequently Nottingham, which was about the same size as 1800 Cambridge, Nottingham was unable to grow outwards. It could only grow inwards on itself. And the consequence is unimaginable overcrowding. It was said by 1841 that Nottingham had got the worst slums in the British Empire outside Bombay. And I think that's not an exaggeration. And that's one reason why many people in Nottingham end up living in caves. It was the only place available to them. Cambridge, of course, doesn't have caves, and it would have been impossible. But the mind does boggle. So here we've got the population, and this is where most of the people are living from the middle of the 19th century onwards. And here we've got Cambridge, the Mill map of 1830, showing what is happening in the early stages of suburbanisation. Here we've got the historic centre, very little changed in terms of detail from 1800. Here we've got the old Barnwell field. This is the area which is now being suburbanised in a very, I suppose you'd call it hit and miss fashion, really. There's this common assumption that towns just grow out in a sort of series of concentric circles from the centre. This is not the case with Cambridge. It is very piecemeal development, according to land ownership, according to the sort of areas that there are, according to what market conditions are like. And so although we have got some built-up areas well over here, again, it is all very patchy. Here we've got the new East Road, an enclosure road. Here we've got Mill Road. Still, there's virtually no building in it. There is simply the mill down here and the beginnings of Covent Garden. Here we've got the Garden of Eden, the Market Garden. But the Height area is starting to develop in a more or less recognisable modern form. And there is quite intensive development out here on the right-hand side of the map as we move along Newmarket Road into Barnwell. Now, who was doing all this developing? Well, it's a mixture. One or two large landowners, particularly institutional landowners, and a large number of speculative builders, working, I think, often on a shoestring, building one or two houses, selling them on, having a go at one or two more. And this is one of the earliest developments by a larger scale developer, Charles Humphrey, spelled with an F. Now Humphrey is a well-known character in early 19th century Cambridge. He was a banker by trade, but he was an architect by choice. And it must be said, a very successful, a very competent architect. And this is the first development that he undertook on Maid's Causeway, the Doll's Close development, which was built between around 1815 and 1825, in a variety of styles. What he's doing is actually building something for everybody, almost here. And so, fronting Newmarket Road, there you've got these big, almost detached houses. They are actually joined onto each other, but only effectively by an entrance and a screen wall. So you've got several of those. All of them are in a single pile. They're not actually very deep. They're longer than they are in depth. On each side you've got terrace houses, and then along the back here you've got what is perhaps the most interesting bit, which is Willow Walk. And Willow Walk really set the pattern for a lot of Cambridge development over the next 20 or 30 years. It was almost certainly finished by 1825, and Humphrey, although these are very small houses, gives them a degree of architectural sophistication, largely by emphasising, as you can see, the central portion here, bringing it slightly forward, putting these pilasters, which are just effectively columns of brickwork, on the front, and then the pediment on the top, just to give some interest to the street. Now, who it was built for, I'm not at all sure, because of course there are no census records before 1841. By 1851, it was a mixture of people, tradesmen of one sort or another, and it was starting, I think, to go down in the world. As you move through the successive censuses, there seems to be evidence that the people living there are less well off. You start to get paupers noted by the 1870s. There's evidence of overcrowding. But I think it's an interesting development, particularly the way that the front doors are grouped together, as you can see there, between each pair of houses. And this again becomes almost a cliche in Cambridge terrace housing down to the 1850s. And of course, Humphrey's best known development is Orchard Street, which was built round about 1830 or thereabouts at the back of Humphrey's big house. He got a very large house with grounds that stretched from Orchard Street through to Parker Street, to Clarendon Street and Emmanuel Street, Emmanuel Road rather. It's sometimes said in one or two of the books about this part of Cambridge that these houses were built for his servants. I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think he was, first of all, had as many servants as this. And secondly, the houses are arranged to give him privacy. There was a very high wall on this side of the street, and the houses are designed so that you cannot see into the grounds from them. The wall is in the way. If it was his servants, I don't think he would have minded them about seeing into the ground, but they're not. They're just going to be ordinary people living there. It is a speculation. And the mansard roof, this roof with two distinct angles changing in the middle, hides the fact that there are actually bedrooms upstairs. You wouldn't know it at all from the front. So the windows are on the back, looking out onto what is really quite a different sort of environment to that at the front. And again, these houses were built for tradespeople, and again, just like Willow Walk, went down in the world. By 1881, every single one of these houses was occupied by two families. And they are tiny houses. I mean, they are basically one up, one down. So you've got to imagine really major overcrowding here, because these are not even small families, 7, 8 children in some of them. And the conditions, once again, can only be imagined. The other big developer in the early days of Cambridge housing, or 19th century housing, is Jesus College, which at the time of enclosure of the Barnwell Field was lucky enough to have to be allocated land nearest to the town. And therefore, from quite an early stage, far earlier I think than any other college, recognised that there was money to be made out of housing. And this is Eden Street, which again, like the Humphrey development, is round about 1830 or thereabouts. Eden Street was, once again, it's a tradesperson's, a service road. The people living here are very largely those, I think, who are making money out of the colleges, out of the university. The 1851 census shows a very large number of laundresses, there are road makers, there are shoemakers, so on and so forth. It does reflect, of course, the fact that Cambridge as a town depends almost entirely in the early 19th century on the university. There's the famous remark made in the 18th century comparing Cambridge and Oxford, that Oxford is a university in a town, and Cambridge is a town in a university. And I think there is an element of truth in that. Well, Jesus seems to have done quite well on Eden Street, started building another similar terrace on the right-hand side. This was never finished. There's really only the central bit, if you go and have a look in Eden Street, which suggests to me, in fact, that they have been over-optimistic and that supply of housing could just have been outrunning demand by the late 1830s, but nonetheless it didn't stop them. And they move on, of course, to this masterpiece of Cambridge town planning, New Square, built over quite a long period, about 15 years, between 1825 and 1840, starting on the right-hand side, in other words, you can't see it, moving round to the east side, backing onto the Kite, and finishing up with the northern side here. It is, of course, only a three-sided square. I think there are probably two reasons for that. The first reason is that it gives people a view out of the square. Certainly the people living at the far end have got a nice view over the square towards Christ Pieces. I think it may also reflect contemporary health ideas, and particularly the miasmic theory, the idea that disease spread by smell. And therefore, what you don't want is an enclosed space where the air can go stale, where the smells can congregate. And having a three-sided square does allow the circulation. Again, the people living here are obviously respectable. By the time of the 1881 census, it is quite a mixture of people. And this terrace over here was almost entirely university lodging houses by 1881. As you move round the square, whether by accident or design, it tends to be less university and more just business people, professional families, annuitants, that sort of thing. But it is obviously one of the masterpieces of Cambridge town planning, and of course, thankfully, having been a car park for many years, restored in the 1980s. And Jesus has really got the bit between its teeth. It continues to develop right through the 19th century. Its great advantage, in some respects, financially, was the fact that it did extremely well out of the building of the railway, which was basically put on Jesus' land, and it also owned what was to become Station Road, laid out in 1845 to connect the station to Hills Road. And it was determined, as you can see here in Station Road, to keep up the social tone. It didn't want the sort of rather mediocre, rather dubious commercial development that occurred around many stations. It wanted big houses. And these were built from about 1867, 1868 onwards, very large, detached, semi-detached houses, all built on 99-year leases on both sides of the road. And that's one reason for the redevelopment of Station Road in the late 1960s, as the leases fell in, so the houses were demolished, the office blocks were built, and of course many of the office blocks themselves have been replaced within the past 5 years or so. And Station Road, I would think, is actually one of the best bits of Jesus' development. Somehow we all went off a bit towards the end of the 19th century. It becomes rather boring. This is particularly the case here, I think, in Bateman Street. Very imposing terrace, but not one that immediately grabs you as being an attractive piece of townscape. And it's mirrored by areas like Walker's Street and Walker's Terrace, again on Jesus' land, exactly the same style of architecture. So that's the institutional investors, builders. A lot more, of course, is done by speculative builders, and done in a rather piecemeal sort of fashion. Newmarket Road, there's Charles Humphrey's development down there on the left. Newmarket Road is a good example of this. Quite high quality housing, but as you can see, it is very much one house, occasionally two houses together. You can tell that by the architectural details, the fenestration, the roof line, etc. And then it's simply put up as the builders move along. There are still one or two big houses put up by speculative builders. This is Bennett Place of 1821 in Mansfield Road. Scroop Terrace, slightly later, I think Scroop Terrace is 1840, in Trumpington Street. These are obviously big prestige developments. Much more common was the area or the low quality housing just off Lensfield Road, between Lensfield Road, Hills Road and Trumpington Road, Newtown. Now the history of Newtown is a complicated one, and if Honor was here she'd be able to tell you a lot more about it than I can. But basically this area was a very fragmented picture of landholding. There was one large landholder, the Pemberton family of Trumpington Hall, who owned the land facing Trumpington Road, and put up big, substantial houses. Behind there, you get this sort of rabbit warren almost of individual holdings, many of which belonged to Addenbrooke's Hospital. And Addenbrooke's was dominated in terms of its board of governors at the time by builders. And the builders seem to have seized this opportunity with both hands to shove in as many houses as they possibly could. And as early as 1850, Newtown was described as a slum, and unsurprisingly, about 100 years later, most of it had gone, just leaving one or two terrace houses, and even these, I think, have gone now, to remind us of these very tiny houses that people were having to live in. Slightly more upmarket are areas like Grafton Street, which again is developed in a very piecemeal sort of way. Again, look at the changing roof lines along there. You can see individual builders have done their own thing. Slightly more impressive building down there, which was the Suffolk Hotel. I think it was probably just a glorified pub, but it called itself the Suffolk Hotel. The Jesus Lane Sunday School was dominating the whole lot. And the piecemeal pattern of development, you can see by the fact that when the street was laid out, this house was the first one on that side of the street, and it had a very big garden stretching along there, stretching along here, and this was eventually sold off, and so the houses on either side, which you might think are more or less contemporary with the big house, are actually built about 40 years later on the site of that garden. And the more you explore the large-scale ordnance survey maps, the more you can see this sort of thing happening. Right, let's move now to Romsey Town. Very briefly, because Romsey, of course, has been extensively studied by the Mill Road History Group, and anything I can say wouldn't add anything to what they've already found out. The important thing about Romsey Town is, once again, it is speculative builders. It is railway, Cambridge. The railway, the Eastern Counties Railway, the Great Eastern Railway, as it eventually became, was the most impoverished of all the major railway companies in Britain, and consequently was not able to afford to build houses for its workers. And as far as I can see, the only houses that it built are this range, just near the Mill Road Bridge, and these were not for the workers, these are for management. These were built for the station master, the goods agent, the motive power superintendent, as it would eventually be known, in other words, the man running the loco sheds. The ordinary railway workers have to live in Romsey. And Romsey becomes this interesting, isolated, very isolated settlement, literally on the wrong side of the tracks, and hemmed in on both sides by railway lines. On the western side here, hemmed in by the main line going north to Ely, and on the southern side, by the original course of the branch to Newmarket, which curves very sharply away from the station. In the middle of what is now platform 4, sharp curve across there, and running out towards Cherry Hinton. And that forms a boundary, a barrier, beyond which Romsey Town can't grow. It's forced to grow down Mill Road, very different Mill Road to the Mill Road we know now, in the sense that it didn't actually go anywhere. It just sort of peters out, as you can see, when you get down here to the Cherry Hinton Brook, into the footpath, the Tins as it's now known, that takes you over towards Cherry Hinton. The other railway you can see on the map is the new Newmarket line of 1896, which replaces the original one. And you might have thought this would be the opportunity for Romsey to start growing south. It wasn't, because the original course of the Newmarket line was retained as a siding, right down to the 1920s, for storing what I think was usually redundant rolling stock, the sort of carriages that Janet will be talking about this afternoon, before they were taken to the breaker's yard. And so it was only in the 1920s, when this line was finally closed and lifted, that development can take place down there. And you can still see very clearly off Mill Road where the Newmarket line ran, simply because the housing changes so completely in character. So here on Marlborough Road, Mill Road's off to the left there, we've got these obviously Victorian terrace houses that would have been looking out onto the railway. The railway is running somewhere like there, along the pavement. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the road, you've got completely different housing of the 1920s, 1930s. Here's just another view. Here again you see, well look, this is taken from the 1920s, 1930s bit, looking up what I think from memory is Stewards Road, towards Mill Road there, a complete change in character. Right, back to institutional development. We're now getting towards the late 19th century, and another big player comes into the scene. And this is Gondwell and Quays College. Now, Quays had been given quite a lot of land at the time of enclosure, and hadn't really done very much with it. It got more in 1809, when, as you can see here, the estate of the late Mr. Panton, who was the lord of the manor of Barnwell, was sold by auction in November. Now, this map may take you a moment or two to appreciate, because north is on the left. So here we've got Regent Street, Hills Road, here we've got Parker's Piece, here we've got Mill Road going down there, and there is East Road. Well, at the auction, Quays decided to already got this land here, there's some Jesus there, then there is more Quays beyond that. Quays bought quite a lot. It bought virtually the whole of that area there, which is where Anglia Ruskin University now stands, and it bought most of the land between Mill Road and Hills Road, with the exception of this little bit here. Lots, I think, I can't see the numbers, but I think it's lot 11 and 12, which it didn't get. And it proceeded to do nothing with the land that it bought, apart from building one or two very big houses along the Gondwell Place there in the 1820s. The rest of it was simply let out for agricultural purposes, market gardening, cow keeping, etc. This little bit that Quays didn't have was very quickly developed, once again by speculative builders. And this is the area around Covent Garden. And Covent Garden is interesting in many respects, but basically because it is so intensely urban, and yet it is, when it was built, it was standing in the middle of the open countryside. Very, very strange, sort of, almost impossible to picture. Well, by the 1860s, Quays was starting to think about development. And from the 1860s, and particularly in the 1870s, it becomes an enthusiastic house builder. The reason for this is that most of Quays's wealth, existing wealth, came from its estates in Norfolk. It was a very big one, of the biggest landowners in Norfolk. And Norfolk was perhaps the county worst hit by the Great Agricultural Depression. If you look at Quays's financial receipts, they take a nosedive from around about 1865, 1866 onwards. It's got to do something to recover the situation. It really did two things. It first of all developed its Cambridge land, and secondly, it found itself very lucky to be in possession of a lot of land around Amersham in Buckinghamshire. And consequently, it owned what was to become metro land. And this is one reason why the college has never looked back financially from that day to this. Well, this is what it starts to do in Cambridge. This is Mortimer Road, 1866 and 1867, which I always used to say, in fact very recently I have said to Janet's group, this is a reflection of married fellows, that college fellows can marry for the first time. It isn't, actually. The people who were living there were just ordinary townspeople, if you like, for want of a better word. They are bankers, merchants, one or two clergymen. There's not a single university person, college person living in any of these. But by the 1870s, as you move further down into Harvey Road, etc., then you do start to get the married fellows. And beyond Harvey Road, as you move down to Glisson Road, you get just speculative building for the middle classes. Very, very characteristic of the Victorian middle class house, these. They're basically semi-detached, but one or two detached ones. They've all got the essential features of the middle class house, which is a very small garden, but nonetheless it is a garden that protects it from the road, and the bay window, which again shouts out to you, I am a middle class house. And the view looking along Glisson Road is interesting. Glisson Road, if you didn't know Cambridge, you came out Hills Road, you would see this very wide road going off to the right as you move in towards the city centre, and you think this must be an important road going somewhere. And of course it isn't. It just stops, effectively, and it stops once you get to the boundary of Keys Land. And as you can see at the end here, as soon as you move off Keys Land, you're in a totally different environment of small terraced houses, back to the tradespeople, etc., that we've been talking about in previous slides. And if you walk around the Glisson Road area, it's an encyclopedia of Victorian, late Victorian housing styles. And again, different styles according to exactly when the houses were built. It's again a rather piecemeal development once again. It doesn't all take place at one time. And here you've got two houses built, I would guess, 10 years apart. Probably one late 1870s, one late 1880s. And they do reflect how the architectural tastes of the middle classes suddenly change as a result of the arts and crafts movement. On the right-hand side, you've got what I think you have to describe as a bit of Victorian Gothic, although there isn't a lot of Gothic about it. The Gothic's a useful shorthand. It's got architectural pretensions, it's got architectural embellishments, etc. It's got balustrades, it's got columns and capitals. Next door to it is a lovely Queen Anne revival house, with all the features that the architects of the period are now going in for. Architectural features derive basically from southeastern England, from Kent and Surrey and Sussex, and become nationwide, and in particular the big gables here and the tile hanging, which you can see both on the gable and on the bay windows here, and also the use of white paint, which, believe it or not, was not widely available until the 1880s. It's only in the late 1880s that it becomes commercially available on a large scale, can be used by builders, and hence the use of it wherever you can, the windows, the brackets, etc. And you can see why this style of architecture gets the sobriquet of sweetness and light. It is sweetness and light. Very quickly, moving on to other bits of Cambridge, Chesterton, developing from the 1830s onwards, New Chesterton as it became known, largely because it was cheaper to live there than it was south of the river. It was outside the borough of Cambridge, rates were lower, rents were lower, and so you get a lot of development around Wisham's Corner from the 1830s onwards of this sort of housing, which is almost indistinguishable from what is happening south of the river, but is going to be cheaper to rent, not least because of the difficulties of actually getting into the town, which we'll talk about in a moment. This is, I think, Alpha Road, and again, rather bigger houses here. You're getting nearer the town, it's easier to get there. And this map, of course, shows the problem of New Chesterton. It is centred on Victoria Road there, which was built around about 1836 and 1837, as a very early bypass to get rid of the traffic congestion that occurred down here on the Northampton Street crossroads. It gets a lot of housing around it. Here are the terrace houses that are being built over here. But the problem, as you can see, is actually getting to the town from New Chesterton. And you may remember that David Stubbings talked to us about Cam ferries at the beginning of the lecture season this year. And although you won't be able to see the details from where you're sitting, the Ordnance Survey maps marks a large number of ferries that will carry people across the river to Midsummer Common, Jesus Green, and they can then walk into town. And it is also, that particular problem, resolved by the new Victoria Avenue of 1889, finally giving Chesterton its road connection to the town itself, and leading to really mushroom development of the area between New Chesterton and Old Chesterton Village. The Freville estate, the favoured Freville estate, as the estate agents always call it, developed from round about 1885 onwards. It seems to start just before Victoria Avenue is built, but really then developing right through to the First World War, with very substantial houses for the Cambridge respectable and prosperous middle classes, and once again all the architectural details you'd expect of late Victorian Edwardian houses to be found. All of these houses big, all of course built for people who've got servants. Right, well, moving into the 20th century, the one player that hasn't been mentioned so far is, of course, the Borough Council. And council housing is very much the exception rather than the rule in the Victorian period. What public housing there was, and I'm using public in a sense in inverted commas there, what public housing there was is the work of philanthropists in the big cities, people like George Peabody in London, for example. Town councils didn't have the money to develop housing themselves and didn't really have the incentive to do it. And all town councils are conscious of the ratepayers breathing down their neck. Ratepayers who are always on the lookout for any suggestion of the middle classes being asked to featherbed the poor by subsidising them with housing. And it's only after the First World War, Homes Fit for Heroes, the Lloyd George's great slogan, that council housing starts to be built. There are exceptions. There are very early council houses in Linton, but they're the exception rather than the rule. After 1919, the Addison Housing Act finally gives money to local authorities to enable them to build housing. And the guiding spirit behind all of this was Raymond Unwin, who, with Barry Parker, had been the man who had founded Letchworth, or not founded, but designed Letchworth Garden City at the beginning of the 20th century, 1902, 1903, moved on to Hampstead Garden Suburb, and was employed by the new Ministry of Housing as effectively its chief housing officer. I'm not quite sure from memory what his exact title was, but that's basically what he did. And he produced the Housing Manual of 1919, which was basically a selection of designs from which local authorities could choose to build the new council houses. And they were all based on the Letchworth Hampstead Garden Suburb model. They were all rather rural in character, the designs. They were intended to give privacy for the whole family, so that boys could be kept separate from girls in terms of sleeping accommodation, parents kept separate from children. Hopefully they would have bathrooms, although this wasn't necessarily the case. In one or two of the designs, effectively you've got to lift up a hatch in the kitchen floor and the bath would reveal itself in all its glory. You just hope that nobody would fall in. This is the semi-detached cottages that are not in the housing manual. These are actually the ones for Hampstead Garden Suburb, but they are copied more or less detail for detail in the housing manual, and looking at them I think you will immediately recognise that if you walk around this part of Cambridge or indeed around Chesterton, that you are seeing these houses. Just round the corner in Hinton Avenue. From here we've got some of the early ones, it's very difficult to photograph. So it's very difficult to photograph at this time of the year, as I discovered, because of course you've got trees and bushes in the way. I should have prepared this talk had I knew I was giving it in the winter, when you can actually see things. But there they are. And not particularly clear about them, I don't know where it went wrong with it, but this gives some indication of the sort of development that is taking place off Cherry Hinton Road there. We're just over here. You've got Hinton Avenue, Cavendish Avenue, etc. All of these semi-detached or sometimes 3 or 4 terraced houses, a complete change to the accommodation that many people would have been having to put up with in areas like Saxon Street in Newtown, and all with the very large gardens, which again was a Parker Unwin idea that people could grow as much of their own food as they possibly could, and also that their health would benefit from going out into the garden. In 1924, by 1924, it was becoming obvious that these houses were in fact over-specified. They were too expensive for the local authorities to build. Economic conditions were starting to bite. The 1924 Housing Act reduced the money available to local authorities, and the consequence is that houses do become less attractive. You move away from the garden city model to a much more utilitarian model, as you can see here on Brooks Road, just opposite Sainsbury's. Speculative builds, of course, running riot in the 1920s, 1930s. Evelyn mentioned at the very beginning house prices, which I must admit I don't know a great deal about, but the important point to remember is that in the period we've been talking about so far, very few people owned their own houses. It was much more common to rent, which had got the great advantage that although you never owned the house, you could upsize or downsize according to change in family circumstances, according to whether you were employed or unemployed, if you were working class. In the 1920s, for the first time, mortgages start to become easily available. At relatively low rates of interest, around about 3%, something like that. And the consequence is that home ownership, which has been an impossible aspiration for many people, suddenly becomes achievable by a very large number of middle-class people, and the speculative builders move in. Some of them national builders already, like Wimpey's, for example. In Cambridge, firms like Sindall make a great deal of money out of building, and these are on Coleridge Road, very typical of the 1930s. The reason I took this, incidentally, was not to show the houses. This is, I think, where the original Newmarket line ran, and it was taken to illustrate that. But nonetheless, we've got them in, and you find them again all over the city, or the borough as it was then, and the new East Cambridge bypass. This grand scheme to link up the A10 north and south of the city via Pern Road, Brooks Road, etc., becomes a magnet for the speculative builders. And if you're sitting in a traffic jam along there, it is quite interesting just to look at the houses and to look at the various details. One of the things that Cambridge doesn't have a great deal of, oddly, is half timbering. That's, of course, one of the great cliches of interwar housing, make it look like a country cottage by shoving a bit of half timbering on the gables. Doesn't happen, I don't know why. And this is a lovely rural scene of basically 1930s housing, but with, I think, a slightly earlier, probably just about First World War house here, Queen Edith's Way, as you can see, approaching the Cherry Hinton traffic lights. And again, impossible to envisage when you know what is there now. The houses are still there, but the streetscape has changed completely from 1935 when this photograph was taken. And this, of course, is the standard layout of the interwar semi, again, the idea of separate rooms for separate functions, a dining room, a drawing room, a garage. This is a very upmarket one. It was unusual houses even in the late 1930s had garages. You kept the car outside or in the street, and quite a big one because it's got 4 bedrooms. And one of the advantages of this sort of design, of course, is it can be made larger or smaller according to the sort of clientele you're aiming at. And also, of course, in Cambridge, you've got the self-consciously avant-garde academic elite who don't want something that the rest of the population is living in, but want something that says, I am a modern house. And the great area for these in Cambridge is Conduit Head Road, off Madingley Road, where you've got about half a dozen of these really avant-garde houses, which were put up in the late 1930s and are well worth having a look at. This is Thurso, which I think is 1938 or thereabouts, but there are several others of them, and it's worth making the effort to get out and just walk down Conduit Head Road. Well, by 1938, this is what the eastern side of Cambridge looked like on the Ordnance Survey 6-inch map. This is the emergency 6-inch map. There was a clear realisation, I think, by 1938 that war was almost inevitable, in spite of Munich, etc. The Ordnance Survey was put to work very quickly at updating its existing 6-inch maps, which dated back to the 1920s, to show development that had taken place for air raid precautions. This was the basic idea. And so the 1938 OS map, which in most cases wasn't actually made available to the public until 1945, does show new development, but shows it in a very diagrammatic sort of form. There's no attempt to map individual houses. It's just a question of trying to show where the housing development was. And so by 1938, as you can see, there's already been very substantial development in East and North Cambridge. North of Newmarket Road, you've got the Ditton Fields estate there. At Chesterton, you've got, again, a lot of council housing in the Green End Road, Karen Causeway area, and also something I haven't talked about and I'm not really going to talk about, housing association housing, the 100 Houses Society, who developed the area around Fallowfield in Chesterton with, I think, some rather superior houses to those that the Borough Council were putting. And by the 1960s, this is what Cambridge looked like from the air. More or less the same area as we saw on the map. Here's Newmarket Road going out there. Here is Ditton Fields over there. And the area on the south side has been developed. The Whitehill Estate area there. There's the Cambridge United football ground. And again, as you can see, a lot of development taking place in Chesterton out towards Arbury. Originally, much of this council development, and then this was council post-war, is really following on the lines that had already been laid down. Semi-detached houses, quite large gardens. By the late 1950s, 1960s, things are starting to change. There's the realisation that density was important. If you were actually going to preserve open spaces, you've got to crowd people in a little more. And Gordon Logie, the city architect, became quite convinced of the need for higher density housing, which you can find in one or two developments in the town itself. The Coronation Street flats are a very good example of that, which is interesting because it's a multi-storey block of flats that is totally hidden until you actually come across it. Nobody would know it was there. But Arbury, the Arbury estate, this is South Arbury, I think, and North Arbury, do show exactly how things are changing. That now there is this idea of cramming in as many people as you possibly can, in the hope that you will create some sense of community because people are living close together, and also that you will give them a community centre where there will be shops, community, social facilities, etc. Of course, in the case of Arbury, as in the case of so many of these developments of the 60s, it didn't necessarily work as planned, and Arbury has, and indeed has had for a long time, more than its fair share of social problems. towns, although it is fiercely protected and defended by the people who live there. And by the 1980s, early 1990s, we're moving on to another phenomenon, which is the deindustrialisation of Cambridge. There are many of these firms, which have been household names in Cambridge, are going out of business, either because conditions have changed, foreign takeovers, etc. And so brownfield development, as the developers had it, now becomes all the rage. And this photograph, which I took quite by chance actually, is the end of Pye at Chesterton, being developed or demolished before redevelopment. And of course the same thing happened to much of the former railway land. The CB1 development around the station, which would look quite at home in some moderately run-down East European city, is scarcely, I think, Cambridge. And of course, out of town, totally different subject, and historians in 50 years' time or so are going to have great fun with the out-of-town developments. Starts with Bar Hill, which I've got a date somewhere, yes, 1965. Bar Hill started, out on the Huntingdon Road, grand plans that never quite came to fruition. If you go to Bar Hill, what you will see is that the developer changed several times, and by and large the houses get less interesting, less imaginative, and more closely planned and put together the further you get away from the A14. And of course the great problem of the place is it is entirely dependent on the A14 for getting in and out. Camborne, much further out, and I think designed to do two things. First of all, to act as a dormitory for Cambridge, and secondly, to also give easy access to areas like St Neots, so that people can commute to London or northwards to Peterborough. Camborne is very typical of its time, the late 1980s, early 1990s, the attempt at a pseudo-vernacular style, and if you're interested in pastiche housing, it's a very good place to have a look, go and have a walk around. It's got one or two interesting buildings, but not a lot. And to go back to where we started, Great Knighton, which is being developed as we speak, very largely with this sort of development, the sort of 3-4-storey flat roof apartments. Yeah, more of them. This, I think, is eventually going to be the town square, Hobson Square, as we call it. Can't wait to see it. There's a bit more development here, and more development there. This is actually some of the rather better bits of Great Knighton. The only advantage I think Great Knighton and Trumpeton Meadows have, apart from their obvious proximity to the biomedical campus, is the fact that they are surrounded by open space, although they're intensively built up within. And finally, of course, Northstowe. The artist's impression of the centre of Northstowe, if it's like most artists' impressions, it will look nothing like that when it's built. And that's Northstowe as it stands last week, photographed from the top deck of the guided bus as I was going to Huntingdon. And it is not, I think, going to look very different anywhere else when it's finished. And just to go back, this is Fitzwilliam Street, 1821. This is Markham Street, 1841, 20 years earlier. And I've often thought, well, first of all, you know, these, to us, are much more elegant than anything that's going up in Great Knighton. But I wonder, at the time, in 1841, in Cambridge, if people said, look at those awful monolithic terraces they're putting up. Where will it ever end? And thank goodness, for a bit of joie d'esprit. Occasionally architects can let themselves go, as in Sintra House, which of course is purely a facade, totally developed behind. And often thought this would look, you know, sort of the principal hotel in some continental town, straight opposite the railway station. It's an architect just having a bit of fun, and when you think that architects having a bit of fun nowadays means that we end up with things like the Mark with its belvedere. I think I do prefer the Victorian version. So, dead on time. Thank you very much.